Have you ever wondered what someone's final moments were like? What their last thoughts were? Did they feel fear? Or did it happen too quickly to even process? For Livye Lewis, a 19-year-old full of dreams, those questions have haunted everyone who knew her. How could such a vibrant young woman end up alone in her car on a quiet Halloween night, lifeless, with a single gunshot wound? Who could have done this? And why? The person accused wasn't a stranger. It was someone she once trusted. Someone who claimed he didn't remember anything at all. But what if the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined? This is the story of Livye Lewis. And this is the question we all need answered. What really happened that night? Welcome to True Crime IQ. Thank you, my viewers. Thank you for joining me as we unravel the chilling stories that keep us questioning the limits of trust, love, and betrayal. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest gripping tales. Stay tuned, because this is a case you won't forget. Let's start from the beginning. Livye Lewis grew up in the small town of Hemphill, Texas, a place where everyone knows each other and life moves at a slower, simpler pace. She was kind-hearted, driven, and ready to take on the world beyond this quiet community. But for all her dreams of the future, Livye's life was tragically cut short. In the early hours of October 31st, 2020, her body was discovered inside her car. The scene was haunting. A single gunshot wound had taken her life, and the town was left searching for answers. As details began to emerge, one name kept coming up: Matthew Edgar, Livye's ex-boyfriend, a man with whom she shared a complicated, often tumultuous relationship. Witnesses from a Halloween party that night described tension, jealousy, and anger. Some said Livye was seen talking to another man. A moment that seemed innocent, but in hindsight, may have been the spark that ignited something far worse. By the time the night was over, Livye was gone, and Matthew Edgar claimed he remembered nothing. What could have happened that night? And why did it all lead to this? Livye Lewis was more than just a face in a small town. She was a sister, a daughter, and a friend. Someone whose laughter could make even the worst day feel a little brighter. Her family remembers her as the glue that held them together. She was always smiling, her mother once said. She had dreams bigger than this small town. Livye had plans for her future, dreams of building a life far beyond Hemphill. But she wasn't in a rush. She loved her family, her friends, and the place she called home. Hemphill, Texas. A town of fewer than 2,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, and most people trust their neighbors without a second thought. Life here was slow, peaceful, predictable. But for Livye, the small town life came with its challenges. She had an on-and-off relationship with Matthew Edgar, a man who, according to those close to her, had a temper. Their relationship was far from perfect, marked by highs and lows that everyone could see, but no one fully understood. Despite the ups and downs, Livye stayed hopeful. She believed in the best in people, even when things got difficult. It was Halloween night, a time for fun and celebration. Livye and her friends decided to attend a local party, one of the few big events in Hemphill that evening. The house was filled with laughter, music, and costumes. People talked, danced, and enjoyed the night. Livye was seen mingling with friends, her energy lighting up the room. But not everyone at the party was in the same celebratory mood. Matthew Edgar was there too. Witnesses later described him as quiet, watching from a distance. Tensions began to rise when Livye spoke with another man at the party. Friends would later say that Matthew seemed off. The night continued, but for Livye, something shifted. When she decided to leave the party, Matthew followed. No one could have imagined how that night would end. Livye and Matthew left together. What happened after that remains a mystery that would haunt everyone who knew her. The next time anyone saw Livye, it was too late. Whatever happened in those final hours, it changed everything. As the Halloween party carried on, most of the guests were caught up in the fun, dancing, laughing, and sharing drinks. But not everyone was in the same spirit. Witnesses later described Matthew Edgar as distant, visibly upset, and watching Livye closely throughout the night. At one point, Livye was seen talking and laughing with another man. What seemed like a harmless conversation between friends quickly became a flashpoint. Partygoers noticed Edgar pacing, drinking heavily, and keeping a close eye on Livye. A few witnesses reported hearing the two argue. One recalled seeing Edgar's demeanor shift dramatically. His voice raised, his frustration growing more evident as the night wore on. He looked angry, one guest later recounted, like something just snapped in him. For Livye, it was meant to be a night of celebration, but for Edgar, it seemed like a storm was building within. And as the party neared its end, that tension would lead to a tragic turning point. Somewhere between the late hours of October 30th and the early morning of October 31st, Livye decided it was time to leave the party. Witnesses say she grabbed her keys, told a few friends goodbye, and walked out into the cool night air. But she wasn't alone. Matthew Edgar followed close behind. Witnesses couldn't say what was said between the two outside, but moments later, Livye drove off in her car. And Matthew, he allegedly followed her. No one at the party could have known it then, but those would be Livye's last moments alive. What happened next remains shrouded in uncertainty. The stretch of road where her car was later found is quiet and isolated, far from the glow of streetlights or the sounds of the town. It's the kind of place where no one would hear a struggle. When Livye's body was discovered hours later, the reality of what happened began to sink in. A vibrant, young life was gone, and the answers were few. What led to this? And why did it all end here? It was the early hours of October 31st, 2020. Halloween was over. The streets of Hemphill, Texas, were quiet, a town that had settled into its usual stillness. But far from the safety of homes and streetlights, something unimaginable had happened. Just off a lonely stretch of road, a car sat motionless. The engine was off, the windows fogged from the cool night air. Inside, a young woman lay slumped in the driver's seat. 19-year-old Livye Lewis. She wasn't breathing. When police arrived, the scene was haunting. A single gunshot wound to her chest had ended her life. Blood stained the interior of the car, a stark contrast to the quiet around it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. A 911 call had brought officers to the scene. The caller, whose voice trembled with shock, described finding the car, the body, and the chilling silence that followed. "There's a girl in the car. I think she's been shot." For investigators, this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most shocking cases Hemphill had ever seen. They worked through the darkness, cordoning off the area with crime scene tape. Flashing lights painted the trees, as detectives combed the scene for clues. But for all the meticulous work, one question loomed over everyone there. Why Livye? Why here, in this isolated spot, on what should have been an ordinary night? As officers processed the scene, their investigation led them to a startling discovery. Not far from the car, they found Matthew Edgar. He was disheveled. His clothes were stained with blood. And when questioned, his responses left investigators with more questions than answers. "I don't remember what happened," Edgar told them. He claimed he had been drinking heavily, and everything after the party was a blank. A blackout, he insisted. A void where the truth should have been. But investigators weren't convinced. How could someone forget the details of a night that ended in tragedy? Was Edgar truly so intoxicated that his memory failed him? Or was this a convenient way to obscure the truth? As they took him into custody, the weight of his presence near the scene, the blood on his clothing, and his relationship with Livye all began to add up. But without answers, the story of what happened that night remained a puzzle, and the clock was ticking to piece it together. The investigation into Livye Lewis's death moved quickly. The first step was to determine how she had died. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already suggested. A single gunshot wound was the cause of death. The bullet had pierced her chest, leaving no chance of survival. Forensic teams examined Livye's car, carefully documenting every detail. Ballistics evidence would later confirm that the shot was fired from a close range. It wasn't an accident. This was intentional. Detectives began piecing together the events leading up to the tragedy. Witnesses from the Halloween party painted a picture of tension, jealousy, and anger. They described Matthew Edgar's growing frustration as Livye interacted with others that night. One guest recalled, "You could see it in his face. He was drinking, and it was like he couldn't take his eyes off her. I knew something was wrong." The evidence was mounting, and all of it pointed back to Edgar. Beyond the events of that night, police uncovered troubling details about Matthew Edgar's past. Witnesses described him as possessive, prone to jealousy, and often quick to anger. Friends of Livye recalled moments when she seemed uneasy about their on and off relationship. One friend later admitted, "There were times when she seemed scared. She didn't talk about it much, but you could tell." The more investigators dug, the clearer the motive became. Livye's interactions at the party seemed to have been the breaking point for Edgar, and his anger had followed her out into the night. But Edgar's defense hinged on one claim. He couldn't remember anything. Edgar insisted that he had no memory of what happened after the party. He claimed he had been too intoxicated to recall the night's events. It's a defense that has been used before. Blackouts caused by alcohol or substance use can leave memory gaps. But the question remains, does a lack of memory excuse an act of violence? Experts were called in to analyze Edgar's behavior and his claims. They weighed in on the science of memory loss, blackouts, and whether it could truly explain his actions. One psychologist noted, alcohol can impair memory, but it doesn't erase intent. People don't simply forget choices they made in the moment. For investigators, the blackout defense only added to the suspicion. Was Edgar genuinely unable to remember what happened? Or was this an attempt to evade responsibility? The evidence against him was building, and soon, the case would head to court, where the question of intent would take center stage. The trial of Matthew Edgar began under the watchful eyes of a community still grappling with the loss of Livye Lewis. Her tragic death had sent shockwaves through Hemphill, and now, as the legal proceedings got underway, the town's focus turned to the courtroom. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Edgar was brought inside. Inside the packed courtroom, the weight of what had happened was felt by everyone present. The prosecution laid out their case with precision. They argued that Edgar's actions on the night of October 30th, 2020, were driven by jealousy and anger. Witnesses from the Halloween party testified about the tension between Livye and Edgar, how his frustration seemed to grow as the night went on. One partygoer told the court, he was upset. You could see it. He was drinking, and he couldn't stop staring at her. It was like he was waiting for something to set him off. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who, in a moment of rage, followed Livye into the night and made a choice that ended her life. They pointed to the bloodstains on Edgar's clothes, the ballistics evidence that tied the weapon to the crime, and the autopsy results that showed Livye had no chance of survival. But the defense pushed back. Edgar's legal team argued that he had no memory of the events of that night. They claimed he was too intoxicated to act with intent, that whatever happened was a tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. He doesn't remember, the defense attorney told the jury. He was in no state to make deliberate decisions. This was not planned. This was not intentional. The courtroom watched as Edgar himself sat silent, his expression unreadable. Was he a man haunted by guilt, or one hiding behind a convenient excuse? The answer depended on who you believed. The trial was already a spectacle, with emotions running high and the media closely following every development. But then, something happened that no one expected. In the middle of the trial, Matthew Edgar didn't show up. When court resumed that day, the defendant's chair was empty. Panic spread through the courtroom as it became clear. Edgar had vanished. A manhunt was launched almost immediately. Police combed the area, following leads and searching for any sign of him. News reports flooded the airwaves, showing images of Edgar and warning the public to remain vigilant. For Livye's family, it was another devastating blow. The man accused of taking their daughter's life was now on the run. For 6 days, Edgar evaded capture. 6 days of fear, uncertainty, and mounting tension as the community waited for answers. Finally, police tracked him down. He was arrested without incident and returned to face the charges against him. But his escape had added another layer of anger and frustration for those seeking justice for Livye. The trial resumed, but the shock of Edgar's brief disappearance lingered over the proceedings. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was faced with a difficult decision. Was Matthew Edgar guilty of murder? And if so, to what extent had his actions been deliberate? The prosecution's argument was clear. Edgar's jealousy had fueled his actions. The evidence of intent was overwhelming. The defense's claim of a blackout, while plausible on the surface, couldn't erase the physical evidence or the timeline of events. After deliberating, the jury delivered their verdict. Matthew Edgar was found guilty of the murder of Livye Lewis. The sentence? 99 years in prison. For Livye's family, it was a moment of bittersweet justice. Her mother, standing outside the courthouse, spoke through tears. Nothing will ever bring her back, but at least we know he can't hurt anyone else. The courtroom was filled with emotions as the sentence was read. Some felt relief. Others, anger. For many, there was a lingering question. How could it have come to this? Matthew Edgar's actions had not only taken a young life, but had left a community forever scarred. As he was led away in handcuffs, the final chapter of the trial came to a close. But for those who loved Livye, the story was far from over. Her memory would live on, a reminder of the bright life taken far too soon, and the courtroom, once filled with arguments and accusations, now stood silent, echoing with the weight of what had been lost. Even with a conviction, the questions surrounding Livye's death linger. Could anyone have seen this coming? Were there signs that were missed, moments that could have changed the outcome? And then, there's the question of Matthew Edgar's blackout defense. Was it genuine? Could he truly not remember the events of that night? Or was it a convenient way to avoid taking responsibility for his actions? Experts weighed in, debating whether alcohol alone could explain such a lapse in memory. Some argued that while blackouts can impair recollection, they don't erase intent. Others suggested that a deeper psychological issue might have been at play, but the truth may never be fully known. This case forces us to confront the complexities of human emotions, love, jealousy, anger, and the thin line between them. Relationships can be fragile, and when trust is broken, the consequences can be devastating. Livye Lewis's story is one that should never have ended this way. But now that it has, it's up to all of us to make sure her life wasn't lost in silence. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous or unhealthy relationship, don't wait. Speak up. Seek help. There are resources, support systems, and people who care. You'll find links and numbers in the description below. But this conversation doesn't end here. Share Livye's story. Share her memory. Talk about the issues that matter, because every voice counts, and together, we can work to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. And before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this case? What lessons do you believe we can take away from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring more important stories like Livye's to light. Hit the like button, share this video with others, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Every story matters. Every voice matters. And together, we can make a difference.